The cowboy saw the Apache girl standing beside a fallen rider and made the oldest mistake a man could make on the frontier. He chose suspicion before truth. The sun was dropping low over the red Arizona desert, turning the cliffs the color of burning copper. Ethan Calloway guided his horse slowly along the narrow canyon trail, the leather creaking softly beneath him, the dry wind carrying the scent of dust and sagebrush. Out here, a man learned to read the land the way other men read books. A broken branch, a fresh hoofprint, a shadow where no shadow should be. That was how you stayed alive west of the Colorado. Ethan noticed the horse first. A bay gelding standing alone near the rocks, reins dragging through the sand. No rider in the saddle. That alone was enough to tighten the muscles in his shoulders. A riderless horse usually meant trouble had already passed through. He nudged his mount forward another 20 yards, the canyon walls narrowing around him like the ribs of some ancient skeleton. Then he saw her. She stood beside a man lying in the dust, her dark hair lifting in the desert wind, a simple Apache dress moving against her legs like quiet water. The man on the ground wasn't moving. Ethan's hand moved before his mind finished the thought. The Colt revolver slid halfway from its holster, the motion smooth from years of habit. The girl turned at the sound of leather shifting. Her eyes met his across the distance. Dark, steady, not frightened. That surprised him. Most people stepped back when a cowboy pointed a gun their direction. She didn't move at all. Ethan dismounted slowly, boots pressing into the sand with a dull crunch. The silence of the canyon settled heavy around them. Somewhere far above, a hawk circled in the fading sky. Step away from him, Ethan said. His voice carried calm, but his grip on the revolver stayed firm. The Apache girl looked down at the man for a moment, then back at Ethan. She stepped aside exactly one pace. Nothing more. Ethan approached carefully, the way a man approached a rattlesnake he hadn't quite spotted yet. The fallen rider was a cowboy, mid-30s maybe, dust-covered hat lying beside him, his chest unmoving. Ethan knelt and checked for breath anyway. Nothing. The wind whispered across the canyon floor. Ethan slowly rose again and turned toward the girl. You were the only one here, he said. She watched him with an expression that was neither angry nor defensive, just tired. The kind of tired that came from walking long miles under a hard sun. You believe what you want, she said quietly. Her English carried the faint rhythm of Apache's speech, careful and deliberate. Ethan studied her. No weapon in her hands. No blood on her clothes. Still, men on the frontier didn't survive long by ignoring what looked obvious. Looks simple enough to me, Ethan replied. The girl tilted her head slightly, studying him the same way he studied her. Then she said something that made the air in Ethan's lungs pause. If you stay in this canyon, she said, her voice calm as the wind through dry grass, you will not live to see the sunrise. Ethan frowned. That a threat? The girl shook her head once. No. Her eyes drifted past him toward the far end of the canyon where the shadows had begun to deepen. It is a warning. Ethan followed her gaze but saw nothing except rocks, sand, and the long purple shadows of evening stretching across the desert floor. When he turned back, the girl was still watching him. Not like an enemy. Not like someone afraid. More like someone watching a man walk straight toward a storm he couldn't yet see. The canyon held the kind of silence that made a man hear his own heartbeat. Ethan Calloway did not like silence that much. Silence in the open desert usually meant something was waiting. He rested his hand on the grip of his revolver and studied the Apache girl again. She had not moved since her warning. The wind tugged gently at the edge of her dark hair, and the fading sunlight turned the canyon walls behind her into towering red shadows. Ethan glanced once more at the rider lying in the sand, then back toward the narrow trail that wound out of the canyon. It would take him maybe 15 minutes to ride out if he pushed his horse. A simple choice. Ride away and leave the trouble behind. That was what a careful man would do. But careful men did not always survive the frontier either. Sometimes leaving a question unanswered was worse than staying to hear the answer. You expect me to believe that? Ethan asked. The girl looked toward the distant mouth of the canyon again, her eyes scanning the land the way a hunter studies the wind. Belief does not change what is coming, she said. Her voice stayed calm, almost quiet enough to disappear beneath the whisper of desert air. Ethan took a few slow steps closer, boots crunching lightly against gravel and dry sand. You were standing beside a dead man, he said. Now you tell me, I am the one in danger." She turned her eyes back to him. There was no anger in her expression. No fear either. Only a kind of steady patience that unsettled him more than shouting would have. "The men who did that are not far away," she said. Ethan frowned slightly. "Men?" She nodded once. "3, maybe 4. Ethan looked down the canyon again. The long stone corridor stretched nearly half a mile before bending out of sight between towering cliffs. Empty. Nothing moving except wind pushing loose grains of sand along the ground. "I see nothing," he said. "You would not," the girl answered softly. "They know this canyon better than you." Ethan crossed his arms slowly, the leather of his jacket creaking. "And you?" he asked. "You know it better than them?" The girl tilted her head just a little. "Better than most." The sun dipped lower behind the western ridge, and the light began to thin into deep orange and purple shadows. Ethan could feel the evening cold creeping slowly into the desert air. He had spent enough nights outdoors to know that once darkness came, the temperature could drop 30 degrees before midnight. He walked to his horse and loosened the canteen tied beside the saddle. The metal cap clicked softly as he twisted it open. After a long drink, he wiped his mouth with the back of his hand and glanced toward the girl again. She had not asked for water. She had not moved closer or farther away, just watching the canyon like someone listening for footsteps beneath the earth. "You keep saying something is coming," Ethan said. "What exactly do you think they want?" The girl studied him quietly for several seconds before answering. "Not me." Ethan raised an eyebrow. "Then who?" She lifted her hand slowly and pointed directly at him. The gesture was calm, certain, like a person pointing toward a distant storm cloud that only they could see forming on the horizon. Ethan gave a short breath of disbelief. "That does not make much sense." The girl lowered her hand again. "It will," she said. The wind shifted then, carrying a faint sound from somewhere far down the canyon trail. Ethan did not notice it at first, just a dull rhythm buried beneath the whisper of the desert air. But the girl heard it instantly. Her eyes sharpened, and she turned her head slightly toward the bend in the canyon. Ethan followed her gaze again. At first he saw only shadows and stone. Then he heard it too. Hoofbeats. Faint, distant, but moving steadily closer through the narrow canyon walls. The sound of hoofbeats echoed through the canyon like distant thunder rolling between the cliffs. Ethan Calloway stood very still, listening now with the sharpened attention of a man who had survived too many bad situations to ignore a warning twice. The rhythm was faint but steady, for hooves striking stone again and again somewhere beyond the bend in the canyon trail. A rider moving fast. Maybe more than one. Ethan slowly tightened the strap on his saddlebag and looked toward the Apache girl. She was already watching the same direction, her posture straight and alert, like a deer that had caught the scent of wolves on the wind. The last light of the day brushed the edge of her face, leaving the rest in shadow. "Those are the men you spoke about," Ethan said quietly. She did not answer right away. Instead, she crouched down near the sand and brushed her fingers lightly across the ground, as if reading a message written there hours earlier. After a moment, she stood again. "For horses," she said. "They have been riding hard for miles." Ethan listened again. The sound was clearer now, for distinct rhythms bouncing off the canyon walls. The narrow passage turned the noise into something larger than it really was, like a drumbeat echoing inside a stone chamber. "Could be travelers," Ethan said, though the words did not sound convincing even to him. The girl shook her head slowly. "Travelers do not follow the same trail as a dead rider." Ethan glanced back toward the man lying in the sand. The desert wind had already begun to cover parts of the rider's coat with fine dust. A hat rolled gently along the ground before stopping against a rock. Ethan felt a familiar tightening in his chest. Trouble had a way of finding him even when he tried to ride around it. He walked toward his horse and checked the saddle straps again, buying himself a moment to think. "If they are looking for me," he said after a moment, "then they made a long ride for a stranger they have never met." The girl stepped closer to the canyon wall, scanning the ridges above them where shadows had begun to stretch like dark fingers across the stone. "You are not the stranger they follow," she said quietly. Ethan frowned and turned back toward her. "Then who?" She nodded once toward the rider in the sand. "That man was carrying something they want back." Ethan looked again at the still figure on the ground. The man wore the simple clothes of a trail rider. Nothing about him suggested he carried anything worth chasing through miles of desert canyon. Still, Men did not ride this hard for no reason. Ethan walked back and knelt beside the rider once more. This time he searched more carefully. Saddlebags, pockets, the lining of the coat. Most of it held nothing but dust and ordinary trail supplies. Then his fingers brushed against something small hidden inside the inner pocket of the man's vest. Ethan pulled it out slowly. It was a folded piece of paper wrapped in oilcloth to protect it from sweat and weather. The paper inside felt thick, like the kind surveyors used when drawing land maps. Ethan unfolded it halfway. The fading sunlight caught the markings just enough for him to see thin black lines crossing the page like the veins of a dry riverbed. A map. Before he could study it longer, the sound of hoofbeats grew louder, no longer distant, but clearly approaching the canyon bend less than 200 yards away. The Apache girl stepped closer, her voice calm but firm. Now you understand. Ethan folded the paper again slowly. The canyon suddenly felt much smaller than it had 10 minutes earlier. The walls towered high on both sides, leaving only one narrow path out. A perfect place for riders to corner a man with nowhere to go. Ethan slipped the map into his jacket and looked toward the girl. You knew about this. She met his eyes without hesitation. I knew they were hunting someone, she said. I did not know it would be you. The hoofbeats were close now. Very close. For horses riding straight toward the narrow opening of the canyon. The sound of iron horseshoes striking stone echoing louder with every second. Ethan rested his hand on the grip of his revolver and looked once more toward the girl who had warned him long before he believed her. The desert wind moved softly through the canyon, carrying dust across the ground as the riders finally reached the bend just out of sight ahead. The first rider appeared around the bend like a shadow sliding out of the rock. Ethan Calloway saw the wide brim of the man's hat before the horse stepped fully into view, then the shape of a long coat moving with the rhythm of the saddle. 3 more riders followed close behind him, their horses breathing hard after the long ride through the canyon trail. The narrow passage carried every sound clearly now, the clink of metal, the soft scrape of leather, the slow thunder of hooves pressing against packed desert sand. Ethan remained beside his horse, one hand resting lightly near his revolver, the folded map hidden inside his jacket pressing faintly against his ribs. The Apache girl had moved a few feet toward the canyon wall, standing partly within the growing shadow of the stone. She did not hide exactly. She simply watched the riders the way a person watches a storm moving across the plains. The lead rider guided his horse forward another 10 yards before pulling gently on the reins. His horse slowed, then stopped. The other 3 spread out slightly behind him, their eyes moving across the canyon floor until they noticed Ethan, the horse beside him, and finally the silent figure of the Apache girl standing against the stone. For a long moment nobody spoke. The wind drifted through the canyon carrying a thin ribbon of dust along the ground. The lead rider tipped his hat back slightly, revealing a weathered face marked by long days in the sun. His eyes moved once toward the rider lying in the sand, and then back to Ethan. Looks like we arrived a little late, he said calmly. His voice echoed softly between the canyon walls. Ethan did not answer immediately. He studied the 4 men carefully the way a rancher studies unfamiliar tracks near his fence line. None of them wore a lawman's badge. None looked surprised to find a dead rider on the ground. The man's gaze finally shifted toward the Apache girl. His expression did not change, but his voice carried a slight edge when he spoke again. Did not expect to see company out here, he said. Ethan crossed his arms slowly. Neither did I. One of the riders behind the leader leaned slightly forward in his saddle, glancing at the man in the sand, and then back toward Ethan. Trail gets lonely this far out, he muttered. The leader lifted a hand slightly, silencing him without turning his head. His eyes stayed on Ethan. We are looking for something, he said. A rider passed through this canyon earlier today carrying a small map. The canyon seemed to grow quieter at those words. Ethan felt the folded paper inside his jacket again like a hidden weight. The Apache girl said nothing, but her eyes moved once toward Ethan before returning to the riders. The leader continued calmly, as if explaining something obvious to a friend. Man we were following had no reason to keep that map, he said. It does not belong to him. Ethan tilted his head slightly. What kind of map? The rider smiled faintly. Not friendly. Not unfriendly either. Just patient. The kind men ride a long way to recover. The wind shifted again, carrying the smell of dry sage across the canyon. Ethan glanced briefly at the narrow passage behind the riders. For horses filled most of the trail now. No easy way around them. The canyon walls climbed nearly 200 feet on both sides, smooth red stone offering no path upward. The leader followed Ethan's glance and seemed to understand the same thing. "No need to make this difficult," he said evenly. "If you happen to find something in that rider's pocket, we would be grateful if you handed it over." Ethan looked back at him. "And if I did not?" The rider's smile faded slightly. He studied Ethan for a long second before answering. "Then this will become a longer conversation than any of us planned for tonight." The canyon fell silent again except for the restless shifting of the horses' hooves against the sand, while the last light of the sun slowly disappeared behind the red cliffs. The canyon air held a tension that felt heavier than the desert heat ever could. Ethan Calloway stood beside his horse without moving, the folded map pressing quietly against his chest beneath the worn fabric of his jacket. For riders waited in the narrow trail ahead, their horses shifting restlessly as the last ribbon of sunlight faded behind the tall red cliffs. The leader's eyes stayed locked on Ethan with the calm patience of a man who believed time was already on his side. Ethan had met men like that before. Men who did not raise their voices because they already believed the ending belonged to them. The Apache girl remained near the canyon wall, half in shadow, her gaze moving between Ethan and the riders. She said nothing. She did not need to. The quiet of the canyon carried enough meaning on its own. Ethan let out a slow breath and glanced once toward the rider lying in the sand behind him. The desert wind had begun to drift small trails of dust across the man's coat. The leader followed Ethan's glance and gave a small nod. "That man rode hard to keep what he carried," he said. "But the desert is not kind to men who run out of road." Ethan shifted his weight slightly, boots pressing into the coarse gravel beneath him. "You seem real certain about what he had," Ethan replied. The leader rested both hands on the horn of his saddle. "We followed him for almost 50 miles, he said. "Long enough to know exactly what was in his pocket." One of the riders behind him chuckled softly, though the sound carried no humor. Ethan studied their faces carefully, the fading light casting long shadows beneath their hats. These were not ordinary trail riders. Their eyes moved too often, measuring distance, studying the ground, watching every movement the way hunters watch an animal that might bolt at any second. The canyon wind whispered again through the narrow stone passage, carrying the faint smell of dry earth and sage. Ethan reached slowly toward his saddle and loosened the canteen strap again, buying himself another moment to think. He took a slow drink, then capped the metal lid with a soft click. The leader watched him without speaking. Finally, Ethan looked up again. "Funny thing about maps," he said calmly. "Sometimes the wrong man ends up holding one." The rider's expression did not change, but something in his eyes sharpened slightly. "That happens," he said, "which is why we came to fix the mistake." Ethan felt the Apache girl's gaze shift toward him for just a second. Not fear, not urgency, something else. Something like quiet expectation, as if she already knew the road he was about to choose. Ethan slipped his thumb beneath the edge of his jacket and pulled the folded paper from inside. The riders leaned forward slightly in their saddles as the small piece of oilcloth appeared in Ethan's hand. The canyon seemed to grow even quieter. Ethan held the folded map loosely between two fingers. "This what you were looking for?" he asked. The leader nodded once. "That would be it." Ethan looked down at the map for a moment, turning the folded paper slowly between his fingers as if studying it for the first time. The fading sky above the canyon had turned a deep purple now, and the first hint of evening chill drifted down from the high cliffs. Ethan lifted his eyes again. "Here is the problem," he said quietly. "4 of you rode all the way out here thinking that piece of paper was the most important thing in this canyon." The leader tilted his head slightly. "And it is not." Ethan gave a small shake of his head. Then he turned and tossed the folded map high into the open air behind him, where the rising desert wind immediately caught the paper and carried it spinning upward toward the darkening sky above the canyon walls. The folded map spun upward into the canyon air like a pale bird caught in a rising wind. For one suspended moment, every set of eyes followed it. The desert breeze that had been drifting lazily through the canyon all evening suddenly caught the paper harder, lifting it higher between the tall red walls of stone. The riders reacted instantly. One of the men leaned forward in his saddle and urged his horse a few steps ahead, craning his neck upward as the paper twisted and fluttered above them. Another rider turned his horse slightly, trying to judge where the wind might carry it when it finally fell. The leader did not move at first. He simply watched the spinning map climb higher against the darkening sky. Ethan Calloway remained where he stood, his hand resting calmly near the saddle horn of his horse, his eyes not on the paper but on the men in front of him. Sometimes the most important moment in a confrontation was not when a weapon appeared. Sometimes it was the moment when a man's attention drifted somewhere else. The Apache girl understood that too. While the riders looked upward, her eyes moved quickly across the canyon walls, studying the long shadows and narrow ridges with the quiet focus of someone who had grown up reading this land like a second language. The paper climbed higher, then the wind shifted again. The map drifted sideways toward the western wall of the canyon, sliding along the current of air that flowed between the cliffs like water through a narrow channel. One of the riders suddenly kicked his horse forward, guiding the animal toward the open space beneath the falling paper. The leader finally spoke. "Careful," he said sharply. His voice carried enough authority to slow the rider before he pushed too far ahead. The paper continued its slow spinning fall, brushing briefly against the rough canyon wall before sliding downward again toward the open space behind Ethan and the Apache girl. The desert wind was stronger now, flowing through the canyon as the evening air cooled. The leader turned his gaze back toward Ethan, his calm expression returning though the faint smile had disappeared. "That was not a smart decision," he said evenly. Ethan shrugged once. "Depends who you ask." The rider behind the leader shifted in his saddle, glancing again toward where the paper now drifted somewhere behind the rocks and shadows further down the canyon. The leader did not look back again. His attention remained fixed on Ethan. "You think the wind solved your problem?" he said. "It did not." Ethan rested both hands loosely on his belt. "Maybe not," he replied calmly. "But it made things a little more interesting." The canyon wind whispered again through the narrow passage, stirring loose sand across the ground. For a moment nobody spoke. Then the Apache girl stepped forward one slow pace from the shadow of the canyon wall. Her voice carried quietly through the cooling evening air. "You rode a long way for a map," she said. The leader turned his head slightly, studying her for the first time since the paper disappeared into the wind. "We did," he answered. The girl looked toward the dark end of the canyon where the wind had carried the paper out of sight. "Then you should start looking," she said calmly. One of the riders laughed softly under his breath. The leader did not laugh. Instead, he looked back at Ethan again, his eyes thoughtful now. "You made this more complicated than it needed to be," he said. Ethan tilted his head slightly. "Frontier has a habit of doing that." The leader studied him for another long moment while the desert wind moved quietly through the canyon and the last light of the sun faded completely from the red stone walls around them. The canyon had grown darker, the last color of sunset fading into a deep indigo sky stretched high above the red stone walls. The wind moved more steadily now, flowing through the narrow passage like a quiet river of air, carrying dust, the smell of sage, and the faint echo of distant night insects waking across the desert. Ethan Calloway remained beside his horse, watching the four riders with the patient stillness of a man who knew the difference between panic and timing. The map was gone now, carried somewhere beyond the bend of the canyon by the evening wind. But the tension between the men had not drifted away with it. The leader studied Ethan carefully, his eyes no longer amused, no longer impatient, but calculating. Behind him the other riders shifted in their saddles, glancing between Ethan, the Apache girl, and the dark stretch of canyon where the map had disappeared. One of them finally spoke. "If the wind drops it near the rocks down there, we can still find it." The leader raised one hand without turning his head. The rider fell silent immediately. The man's attention remained fixed on Ethan. "You understand something," he said slowly. "Even if that paper drifts 10 miles into the desert, we will still recover it." Ethan nodded once. "Maybe you will." The leader tilted his head slightly. "You do not sound convinced." Ethan looked up toward the thin ribbon of sky above the canyon walls. The first stars had begun to appear, faint points of light in the deepening blue. "Frontier teaches a man not to bet too much on maybe," he said. The Apache girl stepped another pace forward into the open ground, the soft sand shifting beneath her feet. The riders noticed her movement immediately. Their horses turned slightly, restless beneath them, sensing the tightening air between the humans around them. The girl's eyes moved calmly across the four men. "You rode many miles today," she said quietly. One of the riders gave a short laugh. "You planning to count them for us?" The leader did not laugh. He continued watching her carefully. "Why does that matter?" he asked. The girl looked briefly toward the dark mouth of the canyon behind the riders, where the desert night was already beginning to settle across the land beyond. "Because the desert remembers who rides through it," she said. The riders exchanged brief glances. Ethan noticed the smallest change in the leader's posture then. Not fear. Not quite. Something closer to caution. "What is that supposed to mean?" the man asked. The girl did not answer right away. Instead, she looked up toward the canyon ridges, where the tall stone edges cut sharp lines against the star-filled sky. The wind passed softly over the cliffs, and somewhere above them a small rock shifted and tumbled quietly down a distant slope. The sound was faint, but in the stillness of the canyon it carried clearly. Ethan heard it. So did the riders. The leader's eyes flicked upward for just a moment before returning to the girl. "You trying to frighten us?" he asked calmly. The girl shook her head slowly. "No," she said. "Only telling you the truth." Ethan followed her gaze upward now. The canyon walls rose more than 200 feet above them, their shadows stretching deep into the darkness. The wind moved along those high ridges differently than it did below. Up there the air carried sound farther, and movement traveled faster than most riders expected. The leader watched Ethan again, noticing where the cowboy's eyes had drifted. "You two seem to think something else is coming," he said. Ethan lowered his gaze again and gave a small shrug. "Out here," he replied quietly, "there is always something coming." The canyon wind whispered again through the tall red stone walls while the four riders sat silently in their saddles, and the Apache girl stood watching the high ridges above them, as if listening to footsteps that had not yet reached the ground. The desert night had settled fully over the canyon now, turning the red stone walls into towering shadows beneath a sky filled with cold, steady stars. The wind continued to move along the high ridges above, brushing across loose rock and dry brush with a soft whisper that traveled farther in the darkness than it had during the day. Ethan Calloway stood beside his horse, his eyes following the Apache girl's gaze toward the tall cliffs rising on both sides of the canyon. He had lived long enough on the frontier to know when someone who understood the land better than him was trying to say something without speaking it directly. The four riders felt the shift in the air as well. Horses sensed it first. The animals lifted their heads slightly, ears turning toward the upper ridges where the wind carried faint sounds down the canyon walls. One of the riders shifted uneasily in his saddle and glanced upward. "You hear that?" he muttered under his breath. The leader did not answer immediately, but his eyes moved briefly toward the high shadows above the canyon trail. For the first time since arriving, he seemed less certain of the ground beneath him. The Apache girl finally lowered her gaze from the cliffs and looked at the men again. "You followed the wrong rider into the wrong canyon," she said quietly. One of the riders gave a short laugh, though the sound carried less confidence than before. "Looks like the only thing in this canyon is you two," he said. The girl did not argue. Instead, she stepped slowly toward the center of the narrow passage, the sand shifting beneath her feet. The riders watched her carefully. Ethan remained still, sensing that something had already begun moving beyond the edges of what he could see. The wind brushed along the canyon walls again. Then another small sound reached the ground. Not a rock falling this time. Something softer. A faint scraping movement along stone somewhere high above the trail. One rider turned quickly in his saddle, looking up toward the ridge line nearly 200 feet above them. In the dim starlight, it was difficult to see anything clearly. Just the sharp edge of the cliff cutting across the sky. Then another sound came from the opposite side of the canyon. Another quiet shift of rock against stone. The leader's expression tightened slightly as his eyes moved from one ridge to the other. "You were expecting us," he said slowly, looking back at the Apache girl. She did not deny it. "The desert tells us when strangers arrive," she replied calmly. The canyon grew still again for several long seconds. Then a new sound drifted down from the darkness above them. Hoofbeats. Not from the narrow trail below. From somewhere beyond the canyon walls. Distant. Many of them. The riders stiffened. Even the horses sensed it now, shifting uneasily beneath their saddles as the rhythm carried faintly through the night air. The leader listened carefully, his head tilted slightly. The sound was far away but unmistakable. Several horses moving across the open desert above the canyon ridge. Ethan followed the sound too, realizing suddenly what the girl had meant earlier. The desert remembered who rode through it. And sometimes it answered. The Apache girl looked toward the high ridge once more, her expression calm beneath the cold starlight. "You rode far to find a map?" she said quietly. The hoofbeats above the canyon grew slightly louder, echoing faintly along the cliffs as more than one rider crossed the open land beyond the ridge. The girl's voice remained steady. "But the land you rode into does not belong to you." The wind moved again through the canyon, carrying the sound of distant horses across the dark stone walls while the four riders sat silently in their saddles and began to understand that the night around them was no longer empty. The sound of many horses moving across the high desert above the canyon grew clearer with every passing second. It rolled along the stone ridges like distant thunder carried by the night wind. The four riders in the narrow canyon listened in silence now, their earlier confidence slowly dissolving into something quieter and far more cautious. The leader turned his head slightly toward the ridge above them, his sharp eyes tracing the dark outline of the canyon walls against the starlit sky. The rhythm of the approaching horses was steady and controlled, not the scattered noise of travelers, but the deliberate movement of riders who knew exactly where they were going. Ethan Calloway watched the same ridge line, his hands resting calmly near his belt while the cool desert air brushed across his coat. The Apache girl stood a few steps away, her face lifted toward the sky as if listening to something deeper than simple hoofbeats. One of the men behind the leader shifted uneasily in his saddle. "That sounds like more than a few riders," he said quietly. No one answered him. The sound continued to grow, echoing along the canyon walls until the riders above seemed to circle slowly along the ridge. Their silhouettes were still hidden by the height of the stone cliffs, but the rhythm of their horses carried clearly through the night air. The leader finally spoke again, though his voice had lost some of its earlier ease. "You planned this," he said, looking at the Apache girl. She met his gaze without hostility. "No," she replied calmly. "The land planned it." The wind shifted again, and a faint shape finally appeared against the stars above the ridge. Then another, and another. Dark silhouettes of mounted riders moving slowly along the cliff line, nearly 200 feet above the canyon floor. Their figures were quiet and steady, outlined by the pale starlight behind them. They did not rush. They did not shout. They simply rode along the ridge, watching the narrow canyon below. The four men in the canyon understood immediately what that meant. They were no longer the only hunters in the land tonight. Ethan noticed the subtle change in the leader's posture then. The man still sat straight in his saddle, but his eyes now measured the canyon in a different way. Not as a place where he held the advantage, but as a place where he had ridden too far without understanding who truly knew the ground. The Apache girl lowered her gaze from the ridge and looked toward Ethan. For the first time since the riders had arrived, there was the faintest trace of warmth in her expression. Not victory, not pride, just quiet understanding. Ethan gave a small nod in return. The leader studied both of them for another long moment before turning his horse slightly toward the open trail behind him. He raised a hand to the other riders. No anger, no threats, just a silent signal. The men slowly guided their horses away from the narrow center of the canyon. None of them spoke as they began riding back the way they had come, disappearing one by one into the dark bend of the trail. The distant riders above the ridge remained where they were, their silhouettes unmoving beneath the stars until the canyon grew quiet again. When the sound of the departing horses finally faded into the desert night, Ethan looked toward the Apache girl. The wind moved gently through the canyon, carrying the cool breath of the open desert beyond the cliffs. "You knew they would not stay," Ethan said quietly. The girl watched the empty trail where the riders had vanished. "Men who chase the wrong thing too far eventually remember the way home," she answered softly. Ethan looked once more toward the silent ridge above them, where the distant silhouettes had already begun to fade back into the night sky. Then he turned back toward the girl who had stood between him and the danger long before he had understood it. Out in the wide western desert, some men carried guns to survive. Others carried something far rarer, the wisdom to see the danger before it arrived.